So we have this tendency, right? Maybe it's just a human nature thing. We turn our founding fathers into statues before the cement is even dry.
We do. We polish them up.
We put them on currency, and we kind of forget they were actual, people with flaws and contradictions and everything.
Right. And usually the rougher the history, the shinier that statue needs to be to cover it all up.
Exactly. But today, we are stripping all that away. We're going to be looking at a figure who is, arguably the most significant Jewish leader since the biblical era. But if you actually look at the source material, the diaries, the recently declassified archives, he barely resembles the nice old man you see on the Israeli banknotes.
Not at all. We are talking, of course, about David Ben-Gurion. And to really understand him, you have to get comfortable with some pretty extreme contradictions.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
This was a man who called himself a socialist, but then built a Western-aligned, capitalist-leaning economy. He was a self-declared atheist who studied the Bible every single day of his life.
And maybe the most important one for our discussion. He was a man who genuinely seemed to want peace, but was prepared to be absolutely ruthless to get a state.
Utterly ruthless. And not just to his enemies, sometimes to his own people.
And when we say ruthless, we're not using that word lightly. We're going to get into some pretty heavy stuff today. We're talking about things like political extortion, assassinations, even some really disturbing allegations of biological warfare.
It's all in the record. That's the key thing here. We're working from some really heavy-hitting biographies, Tom Segev, Shabtai Teveth Plus, and this is crucial Israeli Defense Force archives that were sealed until the 1980s.
And these documents they dismantle the mythology.
They do.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We want to figure out how this specific guy, short, kind of grumpy, obsessed, managed to will an entire country into existence. Was he a hero?
A villain?
Or was he something else, something that just doesn't fit neatly into either of those boxes? He was, I think, above all, a pragmatist, a Zionist Lenin, as some historians call him. That's a fascinating comparison.
It is. But to understand what that means, we have to go way, way back. Before the state, before the army, before the famous wild hair, we have to go to a small town in Poland.
Right. Let's set the scene. He's born David Grün in 1886. The town is Płońsk, which today is in Poland, but back then it was part of the Russian Empire. And his upbringing? It wasn't exactly typical, was it?
No, it was political from day one. His father, David Grün, was what the sources call a secret advisor.
Which sounds like a spy, but what does that actually mean?
It meant he was a fixer, a navigator. The Russian legal system was just an incredible maze of corruption and bureaucracy. If you wanted anything done, you couldn't just follow the rules.
You needed a guy.
And Avigdor was that guy. He knew who to bribe, which forms to file, how to work the system. So David, young David, grows up watching his dad basically maneuver around the law. He learns very early that the law isn't this sacred, immutable thing. It's an obstacle.
An obstacle to be overcome.
Exactly. And on top of that, he grows up with a lot of tragedy. His mother dies of sepsis when he's only 11. It's a devastating loss.
And I was surprised to read this. He actually had a twin brother.
He did, yes, who died shortly after birth. That was a detail confirmed fairly recently from family records. So you have to imagine this young man. He's dealing with profound loss. He's living in a deeply anti-Semitic empire, and he's watching his father manipulate a corrupt legal system just to survive.
It's a recipe for radicals.
Well, a perfect recipe.
And radicalize it he did. By 14, he's starting a youth club called Ezra to promote speaking Hebrew. At 14, I was collecting baseball cards.
He was trying to revive an ancient language, and then by his late teens, he moves to Warsaw and gets swept up in the 1905 Russian Revolution. He's arrested twice.
And this is where I want to pause for a second, because there is a story from this period that it floored me. It completely reframes how you see the man.
You're talking about the gunpoint incident.
I am. We think of prime ministers and statesmen. We think diplomacy, negotiation. We do not think of armed robbery. Can you break this down for us?
So David Grün, as he was then, is an organizer for the Zion Party, a Marxist Zionist group. There's a big garment workers strike. The workers are starving. They have no money for the strike fund.
Okay.
So he goes to the wealthy members of the Jewish community in Płońsk and asks for donations. They refuse. They tell him to get lost.
So what does he do?
Well, he doesn't write a strongly worded letter to the editor. He comes back and he brings a gun.
He literally held them up at gunpoint.
He extorted the money. He basically said, the cause is just, the workers are starving, and you have money. You will contribute. And they did.
Wow.
And in his mind, and you see this throughout his entire life, the cause, in this case, the workers' survival, justified the method. This is the seed of his entire political philosophy. He wasn't interested in being nice. He wasn't interested in consensus if it meant losing. He believed that if the goal is righteous, the tools you use, they almost don't matter.
That is a lot to process. But it sets the stage perfectly for what comes next. So in 1906, he leaves the revolution behind and he heads to Palestine. He has this dream, right? Build a Jewish homeland. But the reality he finds there is just brutal.
It's a complete shock to his system.
Yeah.
He arrives in Jaffa and he expects this romantic pioneering life. Instead, it's hot, it's dusty, it's rife with malaria. But the biggest shock for him was the labor market.
What do you mean?
He expected to see Jews building the land with Jewish hands. That was the whole idea of labor Zionism. Instead, he finds that the existing Jewish agricultural settlements, the colonies, they're almost all employing Arab labor.
Why?
Because it was cheaper, and frankly, they were better farmers. They were more experienced with the local climate and conditions. So Ben-Gurion is this ideologue who shows up and can't even get a job building the Jewish homeland because he's being undercut.
So what does he do? He becomes a manual laborer anyway.
He tries. He goes to Petah Tikva to work in the orange groves. And he fails, mostly. The sources are pretty clear on this. His own diaries say he worked an average of maybe 10 days a month.
So he was starving.
He was literally starving. He caught malaria. He writes about watching his friends die of hunger and disease. It wasn't romantic at all. It was a desperate fight for survival.
And then there's this period where he goes to a place called Sijera, a remote colony up in the Galilee. And the sources describe him carrying a gun, standing guard at night. This feels like the transition from student radical with a pistol to something more like a soldier.
Absolutely. Sijera was the frontier. It was lawless. The colony was guarded by Circassian mercenaries, and there was a movement called Hashomer the Watchman to replace them with Jewish guards.
The idea being?
The idea being that if you can't defend your own property, you don't really own it. Sovereignty begins with security. So he's patrolling at night, gun in hand, living this very tough, militaristic life.
But then, just as he's getting tough, he does this really weird pivot. It seems to come out of nowhere. He stops digging ditches and decides he wants to become a Turkish lawyer.
It's pure pragmatism again. This is the Ben-Gurion pattern. He takes a step back, he assesses the situation, and he realizes the Ottomans run this place.
Okay.
If we want a state, we can't just be rebels in the hills or farmhands in the groves. That's not a strategy. We need to understand the levers of power. We need to work within the system to eventually overturn it.
So he commits to this idea of Ottomanization.
Completely. He starts learning Turkish. He trades his worker's cap for a fez. He moves to Salonika, a major Ottoman city at the time. And he even pretends to be a Sephardic Jew to fit in better.
Wait, he faked his ethnicity?
He adapted. There was a lot of prejudice between the European Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews of the Ottoman Empire. So he just blended in. He changes his mannerisms, his accent. It's all part of the plan. And eventually he gets into Istanbul University to study law.
What was the end goal here?
Right.
To be a lawyer in Istanbul.
No, the goal was to get elected to the Ottoman parliament. He wanted to be inside the halls of power, fighting for Zionist autonomy from within the empire.
It's amazing how flexible he was on tactics. But then, as always, history intervenes. World War I blows that whole plan up.
It does. The Ottomans side with Germany. They become suspicious of Zionist activity, and they exile him. He ends up in Egypt, and from there, he makes his way to New York.
And in New York, he meets his wife, Paula Munweis. We have to talk about his personal life for a second, because he was not exactly winning any Husband of the Year awards.
No. His dedication to the cause was absolute, which meant that his family often came second, or third, or fourth.
So the British formed the Jewish Legion to fight the Ottomans in Palestine.
And Ben-Gurion signs up immediately. He sees it as the chance to get back. But he leaves Paula behind while she's pregnant with their first child. He doesn't see his daughter Gula until she's over a year old.
That's cold.
The cause came first. Always. But for all this soldiering and dedication, there's a really funny detail in the records about his time in the British Army.
The AWOL incident.
Yes. The great disciplinarian, the man who would demand absolute loyalty, goes AWOL. He was a corporal stationed in Egypt, and he just sneaks off to visit friends in Jaffa.
And he gets caught.
He gets caught, court-martialed, and busted down to private. The future defense minister of Israel.
It's incredibly humanizing, in a way. It shows he was still just this stubborn guy who thought the rules didn't really apply to him.
That never changed. But let's fast forward. The war ends. The British take over Palestine under the Mandate. Ben-Gurion comes back and starts his real rise to power, not through the military, but through the labor movement.
Right, he becomes the head of the Histadrut. And we really need to define that because labor federation sounds kind of boring.
Yeah, to a modern listener, a union boss doesn't sound like a state builder. But the Histadrut wasn't just a union. You have to think of it as a state in waiting.
How so?
It wasn't just about collective bargaining. The Histadrut ran its own banks. It ran the biggest construction company in the country. It ran the healthcare system. It ran bus cooperatives. It even had its own secret militia, the Haganah.
So by controlling the Histadrut,
He controlled the entire economic and social infrastructure of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, and he ran it with an iron fist. This is really where that Zionist-Lenin comparison comes from.
Tom Segev uses that term extensively in his biography. What does it actually mean? He wasn't a communist, was he?
No, not at all. He was a socialist, but he despised Soviet communism. He saw it as a tyranny. The comparison is about method. It's about how you achieve power and what you do with it.
Okay.
There's a fantastic story where someone asks Ben-Gurion why he admires Lenin so much more than, say, Trotsky. And Ben-Gurion says, Trotsky's brilliant. He's an intellectual, a great speaker, a great maneuverer.
Yeah.
But Lenin cuts the Gordian knot.
Meaning he just makes the decision that solves the problem no matter how messy or brutal it is.
Precisely. Ben-Gurion didn't want to maneuver. He wanted to decide. He admired that ability to be decisive and, yes, ruthless. And he needed that ruthlessness because his biggest fights weren't always with the British or the Arabs. They were with other Jews.
This is a huge part of the story that I think gets lost in the simple version. We assume the entire Jewish community was united in this goal. But you had the revisionist Zionists, led by Zeev Jabotinsky. Who were they?
They were the right-wing opposition. They saw Ben-Gurion and the labor movement as too soft, too socialist, too willing to compromise with the British. They wanted a more aggressive, militaristic approach.
And by the 1930s and 40s, they had their own paramilitary groups.
They did. The Irgun and the even more extreme Lehi or Stern Gang, and they were actively fighting a guerrilla war against the British.
And this leads to something called the saison, or the hunting season. This blew my mind when I read about it. Ben-Gurion actually ordered his people to kidnap other Jews.
He did. It was essentially a civil war fought in the shadows. The Irgun was carrying out attacks on British targets, bombing police stations, government offices. Ben-Gurion was convinced this was going to ruin their chances of getting international support for his state.
So his logic was that they were undermining the entire project.
His logic was there can only be one authority. So he ordered the Haganah, his militia, to systematically hunt down Irgun members. They kidnapped them, they set up secret interrogation centers, and in some cases they tortured them for information.
And then why?
And then they handed lists of names, hundreds of them, over to the British colonial police.
Handing Jews over to the British. In the middle of World War II, no less. That must have been seen as the absolute ultimate betrayal by the other side.
It was. They called him a collaborator, a traitor. But for Ben-Gurion, it was that Leninist logic again. You have to crush internal dissent to achieve the main goal. If you have rogue militias running around, you are not a state. You are a collection of gangs. He was establishing the state's monopoly on violence before the state even existed.
Which brings us directly to 1948. The British are leaving. The UN votes for partition. War is imminent, and Ben-Gurion has to make the call. Do we declare independence now, or do we wait?
And it was not an easy call. The U.S. State Department, George Marshall himself, warned him not to. They told him, you will face a second Holocaust. The Arab armies will sweep you into the sea.
His own military advisors were split.
They were. Some said they weren't ready. But Ben-Gurion looked at the situation, this very narrow window of opportunity after the British left and before the Arab states could fully coordinate, and he decided to jump.
So on May 14th, 1948, he stands up in Tel Aviv and reads the Declaration of Independence. But he wasn't celebrating, was he? Reading his diary from that time is sobering.
It's chilling. His diary entry from that day isn't about joy or triumph. He basically tallies up the Jewish forces versus the invading Arab armies and is intensely worried. And elsewhere he wrote, "The war shall give us the land."
What a line.
He knew that the nice borders drawn on the UN map didn't matter. What mattered was where the front lines were when the fighting stopped.
And once the war starts, we see the Zionist Lenin in full, terrifying effect. We have to talk about the Altalena Affair. Because if the saison was a shadow war, this was open fire in broad daylight.
It's June 1948. The state is just weeks old. The War of Independence is raging. And a ship, the Altalena, arrives off the coast of Israel. It's been sent by the Irgun from France.
It's loaded with weapons.
Loaded. Thousands of rifles, machine guns, millions of rounds of ammunition, and hundreds of volunteer fighters. Now, at this point, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, has technically been formed, but the Irgun is still acting as a semi-independent militia.
You'd think in the middle of a war for survival, any guns would be welcome.
You would think. Ben-Gurion's government wanted the guns desperately, but he demanded that they be handed over to the IDF unconditionally.
And the Irgun leader, Menachem Begin, who would later become prime minister,
he refused. He agreed to give some of the weapons to the IDF, but insisted on keeping about 20% to distribute directly to his own Irgun battalions fighting in Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. He saw it as the beginning of a coup.
So what did he do?
He ordered the IDF to take the ship by force. There was a firefight on the beach in Tel Aviv, and when the ship tried to resist, he gave the order to shell it.
He shelled a ship full of Jews carrying weapons for the war effort while the ship was sitting off the coast of Tel Aviv for everyone to see.
Yes, the ship caught fire and eventually sank. 16 Irgun fighters and 3 IDF soldiers were killed. It was the closest the country ever came to a full-blown civil war. Menachem Begin went on the radio screaming and crying that Ben-Gurion was a madman.
And Ben-Gurion's reaction?
He went to the provisional government and said, "Blessed be the cannon that shelled that ship."
That is just ice cold.
It's the one state, one army principle, taken to its absolute extreme. He was willing to kill his own people to ensure that the new state had a single, unified chain of command. He believed that without that discipline, Israel would fracture and collapse like so many other revolutionary movements.
So he's ruthless internally. But we also have to talk about his conduct toward the Arab population during the 1948 war. This is obviously one of the most heavily debated aspects of his legacy. And the sources bring up something called Plan Dalet.
Right, Plan D. Officially, this was a military plan drafted in early 1948, a set of guidelines for IDF brigades to secure the areas of the Jewish state allocated by the UN ahead of the expected Arab invasion.
It sounds defensive.
The language is defensive.
Yeah.
But historians like Benny Morris, who has spent his life in these archives, argue that in practice, it functioned as an operational manual for the expulsion of Arab civilians from large parts of the country.
So was there a signed written order from Ben-Gurion saying kick everyone out?
No. And that's the crucial nuance here. Morris argues you will not find a piece of paper signed by Ben-Gurion that says expel the Arabs of Lydda or expel the Arabs of Ramel. But, and this is Morris's thesis, Ben-Gurion projected what he calls a message of transfer.
A message of transfer.
His commanders on the ground, people like Yigal Allon and Yitzhak Rabin, they knew what he wanted. They understood, without it needing to be written down, that a viable Jewish state required a decisive Jewish majority, and they acted on that unspoken understanding.
So it was a wink and a nod policy.
It was more than that. It was what the military calls commander's intent. And where the archives get really, really dark is when you look at some of the specific tactics that were used. You mentioned biological warfare earlier.
I did. Operation Cast Thy Bread. It sounds like something out of a spy novel. Not a historical archive. Is this real?
It is real. It's documented in the IDF archives. In the spring of 1948, as Arab forces were advancing, Ben-Gurion authorized an operation to poison wells and water sources in abandoned Arab villages, and even some that were still populated.
Poison them with what?
With typhoid and dysentery bacteria.
My God. Poisoning wells. That's literally a medieval war crime.
The stated goal was to prevent villagers from returning to their homes or to hinder the advancing Egyptian and other Arab armies. But yes, it happened. It just shows the sheer desperation of that moment and the complete lack of moral red lines when they felt survival was at stake. For Ben-Gurion, survival trumped ethics every single time.
And yet, and here's the contradiction again, the war ends. Israel wins a stunning victory. The army is strong. His generals, people like Yigal Allon, they want to keep going. They want to conquer the West Bank. They want to push all the way to the Jordan River. And Ben-Gurion says,
He stops them cold.
Why? If the war gives the land, why stop now when you have the momentum?
Because he was a pragmatist, not a messianic conqueror. He was always looking at the demographics. He did the math. He knew that if he took the West Bank, he would be absorbing a massive hostile Arab population.
He didn't want to rule over them.
He didn't want Israel to become a binational state. He wanted a smaller state with a solid, stable Jewish majority. It was a demographic calculation, not a military one. He chose Jewishness over territory.
So the war ends in 1949. Now he has a state, but it's a mess. It's broke, it's flooded with refugees, both Jewish Holocaust survivors and Jews fleeing Arab countries, and it's surrounded by enemies who have just sworn to destroy it.
Okay.
This is the state builder phase.
Yes.
And this brings us to another massive, massive controversy, Germany.
The reparations agreement. This might have been the most emotional, wrenching political crisis in Israel's early history. We're talking about the early 1950s. The Holocaust is not history. It is an open, gaping wound. You can still smell the smoke.
And Ben-Gurion decides to do what?
He decides to enter into negotiations with the West German government, led by Konrad Adenauer, to accept financial reparations for the Holocaust.
I can't even imagine the public reaction. People must have called it blood money.
It was explosive. Menachem Begin, his old rival from the Irgun, led massive, violent riots in Jerusalem. They threw rocks at the Knesset building. Begin got on a stage and called Ben-Gurion a traitor, a collaborator with the heirs of the Nazis. He famously shouted, "There will be no negotiations with Germany."
But Ben-Gurion, as usual, he didn't blink.
He couldn't afford to blink. Israel was bankrupt. People were living in tents. Food was being rationed. He took a purely utilitarian, deeply unsentimental view of it. He said famously, "Let not the murderers of our people also be their heirs." Meaning they stole our property, they destroyed our communities, they owe us. We will take that money and we will use it to build ships and factories and power plants for the Jewish state.
And that money basically built the modern Israeli economy.
It was the foundation of it, but it cost him an enormous amount of political capital. It reinforced this image of him as a cold, emotionless leader who would trade sacred memory for German marks.
Speaking of cold calculation, let's talk about nukes.
Yeah.
So sources are clear that he was obsessed.
Obsessed is exactly the right word. From the very beginning, he believed that Israel's conventional military advantage would not last forever. He knew that eventually the Arab states, with their oil wealth and vast populations, would catch up.
He needed an insurance policy.
He needed the ultimate insurance policy, something to prevent a second Holocaust. And so, in total secrecy, he starts the Dimona nuclear project in the Negev desert.
Even keeping it secret from the Americans.
Especially from the Americans. The Kennedy administration was furious when they found out. JFK demanded international inspections. Ben-Gurion lied, he stalled, he had his people build fake walls inside the facility to hide the reprocessing plant from the inspectors.
He risked the entire alliance with the U.S.
He did, because in his mind the bomb was non-negotiable. He believed that without it, Israel was ultimately living on borrowed time.
It's a pattern. He listens to advice, and then he does whatever he thinks is necessary for survival. But there's one event in the 1960s that feels a bit different. It wasn't about survival, really. It was about something else. The Eichmann trial.
It was about shaping the national soul. In 1960, the Mossad carries out this incredible operation, kidnapping Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust, from a street in Argentina.
And they bring him to Jerusalem.
And Ben-Gurion insists on a full public show trial.
Why? I mean, why not just, hang him quietly? Why the big spectacle?
Because Ben-Gurion looked at the younger generation of Israelis, the Sabras, the native-born kids, and he was worried. He saw that they were tough and tan and confident, but they also looked down on the Holocaust survivors.
How so?
They saw them as weak. They used derogatory terms. They didn't understand why the Jews of Europe went like sheep to the slaughter. There was a deep psychological disconnect.
So he used the trial to teach them a history lesson.
Exactly. He put the survivors on the witness stand day after day, telling their stories on national radio for the whole country to hear. It forced Israel to confront the horror of the Holocaust in a way it never had before. It changed the Israeli psyche. It essentially turned the Holocaust into the central pillar of modern Israeli identity. It was a masterclass in nation-building through narrative.
But his own political career, it doesn't end with some grand victory lap. It just kind of fizzles out in this bitter, complicated mess called the Altalena Affair. It's one of those really complex historical weeds. But what's the simple version?
The simple version is a covert Israeli spy operation in Egypt in the 1950s failed disastrously. Years later, it's still being argued about who gave the order. The defense minister at the time, Pinhas Lavon, was blamed, but he insisted he was framed by others in the military establishment.
And Ben-Gurion gets involved.
Ben-Gurion becomes obsessed with it. He demands investigations. He wants to know the absolute truth, who was responsible. The rest of his political party, Mapai, just wants to bury it to save face.
It sounds like he just couldn't turn off that fighter vote. He had to have a final word.
He couldn't. He saw it as a moral crusade for the truth, but his colleagues saw it as an old man tearing the party apart over an old grudge. He burned so many bridges that he was eventually pushed out of power. He formed his own splinter party, Rafi, with people like Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan, but he was essentially isolated. The old man had become a liability.
So he retires. And this is the image that everyone knows. He goes to the kibbutz Stud Boker.
Right.
And for anyone listening who hasn't been there, Stud Boker is not a nice retirement village in Florida. It is a simple wooden hut in the absolute middle of a desert moonscape. Why on earth did he go there?
It was a statement. It was leadership by example. He passionately believed that the Negev desert was Israel's future. That was where the space was. That was where the potential was. And he figured if the old prime minister can go live in a shack in the desert, maybe the youth of the country will follow him there and build the land.
Yeah.
Not really. But the image, the symbolism was incredibly powerful. And it's there in that hut, surrounded by thousands of books, that you really see his personal beliefs come into focus.
Let's talk about those beliefs, because the contradiction theme really peaks here.
Yeah.
We said at the top that he was an atheist.
A devout atheist. He famously worked on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. He ate pork. He had absolutely no use for the rituals and superstitions of organized religion.
But he quoted the Bible constantly. It was his favorite book.
Because to him, the Bible wasn't a religious text. It was a history book. It was a political manifesto. And most importantly, it was a land deed. He loved the stories of King David and King Solomon and the ancient warriors of Israel.
Why?
Because he wanted to connect modern Israelis directly to that ancient sovereign past. He wanted to leapfrog over the 2,000 years of diaspora history, the ghettos, the persecution, the rabbinic Judaism that he saw as weak and passive. He wanted to create a new Jew who was a farmer and a soldier, not a scholar.
But wait. If he wanted this new secular code, this new Shulchan Aruch, as he called it, why on earth did he sign the status quo letter? I mean, for our listeners, this is the document from 1947 that effectively gave the Orthodox rabbinate total control over marriage, divorce, conversion, and public observance of Shabbat in Israel. It seems like the complete opposite of what he believed.
It is one of the single greatest ironies in Israeli history. In 1947, on the eve of the UN vote, he needed a united front. The ultra-Orthodox parties threatened to testify against the creation of a Jewish state at the UN unless they were given assurances.
So, Ben-Gurion, the atheist, cut a deal.
He cut a deal. He promised them control over all matters of personal status.
Well, why? Why would he do that if he despised their version of Judaism?
Because he thought they were a dying breed. He was a modernist, a socialist. He looked at these men in black coats from the old world and he thought, in 20 years, these people won't even exist. The new Israeli will be secular, modern. This is a temporary compromise. Let them have their little rules for now. History will erase them.
Wow. He could not have been more wrong.
He was spectacularly, monumentally wrong. And that letter he wrote in 1947 still dictates the lives of millions of Israelis today. It's why there's no civil marriage in Israel, all because of a deal an atheist made to secure a state he thought would be secular.
That brings us to one last major contradiction. His view on the Arabs. Publicly, he often spoke about coexistence and equal rights. But you found a private conversation he had that tells a very, very different story.
Yes. It was a conversation he had with Nahum Goldman, another major Zionist leader. And Ben-Gurion said to him, and this is a direct quote from Goldman's memoirs, "I don't understand why the Arabs should make peace with us. If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel."
He actually said that, the founder of the state.
He continued. He said, "It is true, God promised it to us, but how could that interest them? We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that?"
That is a shocking admission. Stolen their country.
It shows that he wasn't delusional. He didn't buy into the simplistic propaganda that the land was empty or that the Arabs would just welcome them. He knew on a deep level exactly what the conflict was about. He just believed that the Jewish need for a home, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, morally outweighed the Arab claim to the land. But he never lied to himself about the fundamental nature of the conflict.
Which explains why he was so terrified in 1967.
Exactly. The Six-Day War. The whole country is euphoric. The IDF has just won this incredible, shocking victory. They've conquered the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, the Golan Heights. Generals are popping champagne. And Ben-Gurion, he's horrified.
He warned against the war.
Before the war, he fiercely criticized the government for mobilizing the army. He thought they were putting Israel in mortal danger without the explicit backing of a great power like France or the U.S. And after the victory, while everyone else was celebrating liberating the biblical heartland, Ben-Gurion's message was simple: give it back.
Give back. The guy who said the war gives us the land.
He said, keep a united Jerusalem. keep the Golan Heights for security reasons, but give back the West Bank and Gaza immediately in exchange for peace. He warned that becoming an occupying power over a large, hostile Palestinian population would corrode Israel's soul and ultimately destroy its Jewish and democratic character.
He saw the trap that Israel is still in today.
He saw it with absolute clarity. It was prophetic. He was always looking 50 years down the road.
He died in 1973, shortly after the Yom Kippur War, which was a war that kind of proves his point about the dangers of arrogance and occupation.
He died seeing the country in crisis once again. And he was buried where he wanted to be, at Sed Boker, next to his wife Paula. Not on Mount Herzl with all the other prime ministers and presidents, alone in the desert.
So when we step back and we look at the sledgehammer statue, the real man, what do we see? Is he the father of the nation?
He's the architect of the nation. And like a lot of great architects, he was arrogant, he ignored the neighbors' complaints, and he poured concrete over things that maybe should have been preserved, but he got the building built.
And the ultimate question, do you think the state of Israel would exist without him specifically?
That is the question, isn't it? And I think most serious historians would say no. You needed someone with that very specific, very strange blend of socialist organizing skill, biblical fervor, and pure Leninist ruthlessness to navigate the labyrinth of 1948.
A nicer man would have failed.
A nicer man would have failed. A more democratic man would have hesitated at the Altalena. A more sentimental man would have refused German money. Ben-Gurion he cut the knot.
And the knot is still cut that way today.
For better and for worse.
I think if you really want to understand why Israel looks the way it does today, from its military ethos to its tangled religious laws to its ongoing conflicts, you have to start with Ben-Gurion. And I highly recommend, if you're interested, looking up that status quo letter we mentioned. It is a one-page document that is a fascinating and deeply consequential rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.